Shalom Uvracha. The Rambam at the beginning of Moreh Nevuchim brings a wondrous question, she'ela mufla'a, a wondrous question in the name of a wise man. And the question relates to the sin of Adam Harishon, of Adam. How is it possible that Adam profited, he gained from sinning? Before the sin, he didn't know good and evil. After the sin, he became Kelokim, like God, knowing good and evil. How can you gain from sinning? Says the Rambam, he didn't gain anything. He only lost. Before sinning, he was occupied with truth and falsehood, pure logic, pure knowledge. After the sin, he became occupied with beauty and ugliness, with good and evil, which is subjective, depending on the social situation, on social constructs, on time and place, subjective. It's a descent, it's a loss, it's not a gain, says the Rambam. But the simple reading of the verses has difficulty with this interpretation. Later on, Hashem says, Hein Adam, haya ke'echad mimenu. Adam has become like one of us. Yodea tov v'ra. He now knows good and evil. Definitely sounds like a virtue, like a gain, like becoming godly. How could Adam gain from this sin? So it seems perhaps that really Adam Harishon gained a virtue from the sin. He gained the knowledge of good and evil, which is something godly. However, for humanity, for humankind, this came at a terrible cost. And the cost, the price he paid for this virtue was the loss of the innocence that enabled true relationship. A relationship that is full and complete. Before the sin, Adam Harishon, together with Chava, with Eve, could bring themselves in a complete way. They needed no clothing, not physically and not metaphorically. They were able to be themselves totally in absolute trust, in absolute relationship with Hashem, with God. After the sin, that trust was broken. The knowledge of good and evil gave them an entirely different perspective on the world, a perspective of constant suspicion. One cannot bring him or herself completely into a relationship because maybe the other person on the other side of the relationship will take advantage of my sincerity, of my vulnerability, will take advantage of my exposure. Perhaps the other side will manipulate me for his or her own benefit. And this applied even to Hashem himself. The relationship, the pureness of the relationship with Hashem was broken, was flawed. That's why they needed to clothe themselves. They needed to hide something. And straight away, Hashem says, have you eaten from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil? And therefore there was no longer a place for them in the Garden of Eden, in Gan Eden. Gan Eden was a place for innocence, for that childhood, as it were, childlikeness, in which we can engage in full trust, in full relationship, without this lingering suspicion that somebody is going to manipulate me or take advantage of my trust. Adam and Eve were banished from Gan Eden and began a journey of return. But how do we return to that lost innocence? How do we return to Gan Eden? Some believe in the more progressive avenues of our planet that it's possible to recreate that innocence, to recreate that situation of the Garden of Eden by force. We can do it. And the way we do it is to dismantle those institutions that human beings have created in order to deal with the issues of good and evil, to deal with this mistrust, whether it's the family, whether it's nations, countries, states, whether it's other boundaries, partitions that come between people, that come between groups, whether it's laws. We make laws in order to deal with good and evil. We deal with the permitted and the prohibited. We deal with the pure and the impure. That's what we deal with on our day-to-day level. There is an attempt out there to dismantle all of that in a hope that we can recreate that lost innocence, that we no longer need those partitions, we no longer need those weapons of deterrence, because we can go back to a state of pureness and of innocence. However, those attempts, when taken to an extreme, are doomed to fail, because we have internalized that perspective of good and evil. It's part of our DNA. We're hardwired like that. We are unable to, by force, recreate, return to that state of the Garden of Eden. Even if we create a safe space, ultimately it will deteriorate into a cancel culture in which we're suspicious, each one of the other. Maybe he's doing something wrong, like indeed we find in other attempts like communism and other attempts at recreating this Garden of Eden, this place of innocence. The Torah has a different prescription for returning to this innocence, to this place of complete trust, and that is life in Eretz Israel, life in the land of Israel. Because the land of Israel, as the Torah tells us, is different to Egypt, in which there was water everywhere, and different to Gan Eden, in which also was filled with rivers, filled with waters. Life in the land of Israel requires of us to trust God, to turn our eyes heavenward and to pray, to hope that the rains will fall. And even in an age where rains are less important, we're less dependent on rainfall, but we're certainly dependent on a lot of compassion and a lot of divine assistance. Life in the land of Israel remains entirely precarious. We do not know what tomorrow will bring. We are surrounded by enemies, and life is far from simple. And therefore we continue this life in the land of Israel, which is totally dependent on Hashem, on turning our eyes to God and flexing, training that muscle which is called trust. This is what the Torah requires of us more than anything else, to trust Hashem, to place our faith, our hope, and our trust in God. That's the idea of living in the land of Israel and keeping the Torah, which is Hashem's Torah, and trusting in His ultimate goodness. We flex that muscle, and through that we earn not just our own trust in Hashem, but also trust in others. We're able to provide a balance, an equilibrium between the continuing state of humanity that knows good and evil. We cannot ignore that. We cannot by force return to some imposed Garden of Eden. It won't work, but we can mitigate it by training ourselves in the art, in the muscle, as it were, of trust, of trusting Hashem, and therefore of trusting others. And through this, we will ultimately reach that final level where the Torah tells us that we will reach a time, V'gar ze'ev in keves, where wolf and lamb will be able to coexist, metaphorically, of course, and Mala haaretz das es Hashem, the land will become filled with the knowledge of God, with this absolute trust, this absolute faith, as it was in Gan Eden Mikedem. We should all have a wonderful Shabbos.